How's it going, everybody? Jordan here, and in today's video I'm gonna go over my new epic Viking tank build for Assassin's Creed Odyssey. This build absorbs so much damage yet deals out tons of damage just like a really tough Viking. On top of that, with the mixture of being able to take a punch and deal a punch, this build is incredibly fun to play, especially on Nightmare mode. You will literally not be able to die with this build. You will have to work at it to die playing this build. Before we get into all the details, remember, if you enjoy this video, please leave a like. It helps support the channel a lot. Let's get right into it. So this is the Viking tank build. It's an epic build made up of epic gear, and because of that, it's very well optimized. Now, if you're unable to get this epic gear, I do have a video that I made on the Greek Heroes set, which is also an equally tanky build and incredibly fun to play, and it's a legendary set, so it's easily acquired in the game. What makes this Viking set amazing is the fact that at level 91 perk levels, the full 10 perk levels on your epic gear, you can get as high as 90% melee and range resistance on your character, as well as additional armor and health. When you match that with chance to ignore half damage, you literally can get hit by nightmare enemies as high as mythical creatures, and it feels like a breeze. You don't believe me? Then look at this. It takes Sterops about 2 minutes to kill you with this build, and this is on Nightmare. It's absolutely ridiculous. And the best part of it is this build still packs a punch. It doesn't deal as much damage as other builds do, but when turning the flame on and using your Viking Berserker axe, you can melt enemies down still incredibly quickly with this build. If you struggle playing on Nightmare mode, this might be the build that helps usher you in to Nightmare and allow you to start practicing parries, because what's excellent about it is you can just sit there and take hits for 5-10 minutes. You could go into a bathroom break with this build and come back and you'll still be alive. So it gives you enormous potential to learn the game, to practice your dodges, your parries, or if you're already good at the game, it feels so strong to play, and that's why I kind of centered it around the Viking theme, and we're using those heavy axes. The reason I chose to use the heavy axe with this build is because heavy axes and heavy blunts are incredibly slow moving weapons. They have the slowest attack speed in the entire game, and when you are not tanky and you're using these weapons, there's a lot of opportunities for enemies to come in and hit you. They do pack a large punch when they hit, but you're also getting hit a lot while you're using them. So this is the perfect build to tailor those heavy weapons to, because you can take a couple hits and it doesn't matter at all. Alright, let's get into the specifics of the gear. So I'm running with 2 of the same identical axes in my primary and secondary slot. That's going to be warrior damage, damage with heavy bladed weapons, crit damage, and fire damage. And as you can see, it's going to be the same thing on my secondary weapon. This is where all the damage is focused on with this build, is in the weapons and the bows. For the bow, we're going to run with the warrior damage, crit chance, fire damage, and then we engrave it with the Sterops bow legendary engraving of 20% health and armor. Alright, let's get into the armor. So for the head, we have warrior damage, crit chance while at full health, range resistance, and chance to ignore half damage. The reason I'm doing crit chance is even with this build, I still want to get it to an above 80, around 90% crit chance to still have that damage. For the gauntlets, we have warrior damage, armor, range resistance, and melee resistance. Again, because we're at the full level 10 perk set, we're getting 30% range resistance and melee resistance on this armor, which is making this build incredibly tanky. For the chest, we have warrior damage, armor, health, and then we engrave it with the Greek Heroes legendary engraving, which gives us an additional 15% of all resistances. For the waist, we have warrior damage, chance to ignore half damage again, crit chance, and then we engrave additional melee resistance on top of that. And then for our boots, we have warrior, crit damage, and crit chance, and then fire damage. So the boots are bringing more damage to the build, while the other pieces of the armor are focusing on tankiness. Alright, let's look at the masteries for this build. Again, like all the other builds, if you don't have enough ability points, just focus on these primary ones that I'm going to tell you. And the primary ones are going to be melee resistance on the warrior tree, range resistance on the hunter tree, and elemental resistance on the assassin tree. And then fourthly, we're going to want to put points into chance to ignore half damage on the assassin tree, damage while at full health, crit damage while at full health, crit chance while at full health, and then lastly, you're going to want to put some points into damage restored as health. Once you do that, what damage you do take will be given back to you with single hits, thus allowing you to literally never die. If you happen to have the extra points, putting points into fire damage, additional health and armor, warrior damage, damage with heavy bladed weapons, and finally crit damage on the hunter side of things. Alright, let's look at the stats for this build. Again, as always, in the description of this video is the build details on the ac-builds.com build site. You can access all the gear and all the stats for this build there from your mobile phone or your computer, so you don't have to come back to this video if you don't want to. So the main thing is, let's look at the defensive modifiers first. We have a 52% health bonus, a nearly 300, but it's actually 266% armor bonus, a nearly 90% melee resistance, 90% range resistance, and then a nearly 38% elemental resistance. Finally, a 98% chance to ignore half damage. This is the peak of tankiness. In addition to the damage that enemies deal to you, all melee hits and ranged hits are being reduced by 90% on top of the armor that's already there, and on top of that, that damage is being cut in half, thus showing you that this build just absorbs hundreds of hits without having any visual impact. Lastly, the big thing to look at here is how much damage it still actually does. We still achieve a nearly 83% crit chance at full health, and when we do crit, we're getting 355% additional crit damage. Stack that with the 78% damage with heavy bladed weapons, and when your fire ability is on, you're stacking another 212% fire damage. So in addition to that tankiness, it's not the most crit damage, but it's still a lot of crit damage that is pumped out of this build, making it really powerful. Alright, let's look at my primary abilities. Because I'm trying to maximize the build, again, I'm going to be using flaming attacks instead of weapon becomes fire damage. So the primary ability slot is going to be flaming attacks to get that additional fire damage. The secondary ability is going to be Ring of Chaos because you're going to deal a lot of damage from it. It's great crowd control as a warrior. The third is going to be Slow Time. I really enjoy Slow Time for positioning when you're fighting enemies. And then lastly, Second Wind. This build is a little weaker to elemental damage, you may notice, especially on Nightmare, but if you get caught with too much poison or fire or something, you can quickly use Second Wind to get rid of that elemental damage. And then lastly, I put some points into Devastating Shot for additional hunter damage should I choose to use that, and then the rest are in passive abilities. And then because I like the overpowered attack for the axes, I put points into overpowered attacks. Alright, let's look at the Transmog for this build. For the helmet, we're using the bull helmet with the plated copper version. For the gauntlets, we're using the plated vambraces, again the plated copper variation. For the chest, we're using the black variation of the Ancient King's body armor. And then for the waist, we're using the black version of the Ancient King's waistband. And then on the boots, we're using the heavy Spartan Greaves plated copper variation. And then finally for the axe, we're using the Berserk axe, the plated copper edition. I think this makes the whole build look very Viking-esque with the horns and the Berserker axe. So that's my Berserker Viking tank build. It really feels like you're a Viking with this build, and it honestly makes me wish that eventually we will get a really cool Viking Assassin's Creed game. I don't think it'll be the next one, but eventually I hope the developers at Ubisoft give us a really cool Viking game. I really like how this feels and the concept of being an indestructible Viking with horns and a big axe. It feels really fun and it's really cool. The question I had for you in the comments is like, what perks or things do you tend to favor? I feel like I'm a very focused kind of crit and chance to ignore half damage. I've really gotten into a habit, and so I kind kind of want to know what you guys, or interesting different things you guys use on your build. So maybe I can learn something from you, or something you've done differently that's interesting. Please share it with me in the comments. I'd love to hear that. Lastly, if you enjoyed the video, please remember to leave a like. It means a lot and it really supports the channel. And subscribe and hit that bell if you enjoyed this video and you'd like to see more Assassin's Creed Odyssey content. As always, I appreciate all of you, and I'll see you guys next time.
So proud of those born to be Spartans.